Our first panel revolves around China's policies on climate change and how these policies may affect China's economic growth and development. Today, we're honored to have with us three esteemed speakers. Starting from my far left, the current China Program Manager at the International Energy Agency, Mr. Kevin Tu. Next, we have the Greater China Director of the Climate Group, Ms. Wu Changhua. And finally, we have the Chair of the Grantham Institute for Climate Change at Imperial College London and the moderator of this panel, Sir Brian Hoskins.
Hello.
Please allow me to hand the stage over to Sir Brian Hoskins.
Thank you very much indeed. So welcome to this. We thought we might call this, as opposed to the other session, One Planet. Okay, so one planet, one system. Right, so I'm going to introduce the discussion here, and that's me, and that's also me. So I'm just going to give you a few introductory slides to just make a context then for the other members of the panel to take the discussion on. So I thought I would actually start with a couple of pictures of what has happened to the climate system and what might happen in future. And these are taken from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change report a couple of years ago. And this is just one to remind us that the planet has warmed, and it's warmed almost everywhere in the last 100 years. And so China's on the right here, but you can see the colours here over the last century. Then southern China might have warmed somewhere near 0.5 degree, whereas northern China you might be up to nearer 2 or 2.5 degrees. So the warming through China is comparable with the rest of the continents, increasing towards the northern pole. And the global warming during this period is about 0.8 of a degree, but that's because there's a lot of ocean, and it's usually more than that over land, and it has been over China. And at the same time, we've lost a lot of ice at the polar regions. Sea level has risen by about 20 centimeters. Heavy rainfall has increased in many places around the world, including in China. Of course, natural variability is there all the time, and much of the variability between the Yellow River Valley and the Yangtze is a sort of natural variability, but then there's climate change added on top of that. So the climate system is changing, but then what might happen in future? Well, if we don't take the problem seriously, then this is what the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change said the changes would be by the end of the century. And remember, this is adding on to the sort of the order of 1 or 2 degrees that we've already had. And this is, globally, this is about 4 degrees more. But if you look over China, then it reflects what is going on elsewhere, and we're thinking of something like somewhere to 3 to maybe 9 degrees across a warming across China from the south to the north. So China would warm very considerably, as would the rest of the world that China trades with. And the sea level might rise by somewhere between 0.5 and 1 metre, probably during that period. And again, that would have impacts on many low-lying countries in the world and also delta regions in China and elsewhere. And sea ice would be disappearing, and maybe somewhere in the middle of the century, we would expect to see sea ice disappear in the northern polar region, but reform again in the winter. So the climate system would change very considerably. That's if we don't do much, and this is the contributor to that. Various countries and groups of countries around the world. This is the emissions of carbon dioxide from fossil fuel and cement production. Of course, there are other greenhouse gases and other ways of producing them, but this is the predominant way that we have warmed the climate, by adding the carbon dioxide from fossil fuels and cement production. And you can see then the United States at the bottom there, and the European Union and other contributors, and then China in the red bit in the middle there, expanding its contribution and overtaking the US in terms of that contribution rapidly from the year 2000 onwards. And clearly what happens in China is absolutely crucial to what happens in the world at this point. Now, if we're going to actually tackle this climate change problem, as has been suggested and agreed in Paris, then this is the sort of thing that global emissions must do, at least this, because Paris has said below 2 degrees, even thinking of 1.5, but this is more like the 2 degrees number. And on the left, then, this is not a uniform axis here, so we have historical emissions in blue of carbon dioxide or carbon dioxide equivalent, taking the other greenhouse gases. But then the orange ones are where we should be in 2025, 2030. There's a range, and then 2050. And if we take that 2050 level, for instance, then, and you apportion that between the citizens of the world that we expect to be around at that time, that means roughly just over 2 tons of CO2 per person per year. And this is what we presently are then. This is the per capita greenhouse gas emissions. So there's the US and Canada over 20 and Australia. And the UK somewhere around 8. China somewhere around 5 to 6. And you see the yellow colour there. But what we've got to be by 2050 is essentially somewhere between the light green and the dark green. So we've got to be back to those levels. Even China has got to reduce a major amount by 2050 if we're going to achieve that sort of level. So that's the sort of background to the discussions then. Now, China did make commitments in the run-up to Paris, and I've just listed some of those here. The high-level one was that greenhouse gas emissions from China would peak by 2030, maybe before, and commitments on renewables, a large amount of the energy in China being produced by renewables by 2030, with lots of wind and lots of solar, strengthen research and development in low carbon and more efficient coal, which is very important in China, reforestation, build-up of a carbon trading system. There's a trading system in Europe, and maybe building on one up in China, and perhaps thinking of linking these together, and set up a very significant climate fund. So see, these are some of the things that China was saying in the run-up to Paris. But I think I've said enough now, and I would like to hand over now to Chunghua Wu, who's going to take us on from this point.
Sure, thank you. Thank you, Sir Brian, and thank you all for being here. I was sitting in the room earlier before we started. I said, since Paris, actually, last month, this is the first time I felt like a minority, because in Paris and after Paris, actually, wherever I went, was so many people interested in, actually, the climate change issues, particularly China's position. But anyway, this is a classroom setting, so I'm honored to be here. I was asked to look at the issue to help you understand through 3 particular angles. One is how has China tackling climate change issues, so I'm going to touch upon that. The second one actually is what's unique about China's policy or actions. And the third angle will be look at the role of China, particular to the Paris Agreement actually success the process. So let me start in sort of 10 minutes time. Let me start with the first one. The way China tackles climate change issues is not just a carbon issue, rather it's a rather integrated way of thinking. So there are 4 major aspects that pretty much on top of the agenda in the current policy framework in China. One is a restructuring or structural change. That includes both the industrial and economic structure. So that has already been happening. The second one is really looking into how to cap the overall energy consumption, particularly actually cap the consumption of coal. The third piece of the puzzle actually is really to capture the efficiency or productivity of the energy sector as much as possible. And the fourth piece of the puzzle actually is really to develop alternative energy as much as possible. So that's a sort of in an integrated manner. So it's not just for the sake of environmental issues, but really, most importantly, how to address, this sort of dilemma actually between the growth and environmental context there. Specifically, how do we do it? And so there are a few things to highlight. One, China does plan, and so we do planning, 5-year planning, and the 13th one actually is coming up in March. Everyone actually expecting that now. And so we set targets for short term every 5 years, and so that's sort of the cycle we do things. And we started 10 years ago, actually, 11th 5-year plan, Chinese government started to set mandatory quantitative targets around efficiency, around intensity. It's more like around productivity, actually, of the energy consumption. So we said between 2005 and 2010, the government set 20% energy intensity target over that 5 period of time. In the meantime, we also set targets around the renewable energy development, plus actually we also set the forestry, the growth of the forestry coverage areas in China as well, which is part of addressing the carbon sink issues of the climate change issues there. The 11th 5-year plan happened to be a very important period of time. So that was the first time we seriously put targets on the table and trying to deliver that. And it was a huge learning process. I think in that process, which was a bumpy, partly because actually no one expected actually back in 2005 that there was financial crisis, global financial crisis coming, and we didn't really know that at all. And so when the financial crisis came, you had to do the stimulus, you had to rescue, so stimulus package. So China went through a rather bumpy period of time during the 11th 5-year plan, particularly the latter half of that. But the country actually pulled well in terms of the target. We set 20% energy intensity target. We delivered 19.1%, which is not too bad at all, actually. But we did achieve also air pollution target there as well. We set a target on sulfur dioxide. We kept that already. We started to increase 10%. We over-delivered that as well. I said it's a learning, it's important, is that because of the learning, so the decision makers build upon that, gain a lot of confidence. So getting into the 12th 5-year plan, which we just completed actually, so we continue to set targets, mandatory quantitative targets. So besides energy intensity target, because came along actually 2009, Copenhagen, so we started to also set carbon intensity target. So back then, actually, leading up to Copenhagen, we said, by 2020, we're going to deliver carbon intensity target of 40 to 45% over the 2005 level. So naturally, we built that actually into the national plan as well. So we said 17% actually in the 12th 5-year plan. We pretty much delivered that actually in the last few years, last 5 years there. So we had energy intensity target, carbon intensity target, alternative energy target, renewables in particular, but also during the 12th 5-year plan, we also set percentage of the contribution to GDP from 7 strategic emerging industries. That's sort of related to the first piece of the puzzle, which is the structural change. In order to grow out of the heavy polluting, heavy energy consuming sort of industries, we call clean tech in a sort of roughly manner to call that. So we set a percentage contribution target actually from those 7 strategic emerging industries. We will see in March, we'll see the Premier's report in terms of how we delivered actually the 12th 5-year plan. I think overall the expert community has pretty much done roughly all kinds of assessment. I feel confidently actually, I think we're definitely on that. The 10-year learning is very, very important, and during that 10 period of time, actually, a lot of things has happened. So we more like looking into the second point, actually, how the uniqueness or whatever the policy context in China. There are a few things. One, China continues to demonstrate relatively strong sort of top-down sort of command and control and mechanism or governance, and that is why actually if the political leaders get it in China, they drive the agenda and they integrate those sort of targets agenda into the national policy, and that's built into the 5-year plan, and we deliver them, right? The second way, actually, the decision makers also recognizes actually it's not enough to just have the top-down part. So we started to really get more and more bottom-up elements built into the policy mechanism there as well, particularly actually opening up more to private sector and social forces actually. For instance, China in the last few years opened up energy sector investment and also investment from the market into some important pillar sectors actually in China in the economy already. So that's very encouraging there as well. Thirdly, actually, and we know command and control remains very, very important to addressing public goods issues like climate change, but that's not adequate. So we started to also to explore the market-based instruments. And so during the 11th five-year plan, that was the period actually when, 2008 to 2012, that was the 5-year sort of compliance period for Kyoto Protocol. During that period of time, there was a mechanism called the CDM, Clean Development Mechanism, as a part of the international mechanism. China quickly built up capacity for that particular sector to really tap into the CDM market globally, because through that we bring in capital, of course, and also international expertise to help us improve the energy efficiency, reducing emissions there as well. And then gradually getting into the 12th five-year plan, we roll out actually the 7 piloting schemes of carbon markets in China, and they've all been up and running since 2013. And of course, last year, the president said in New York, and basically said next year, 2017, we're going to roll out national carbon market. So everyone was waiting to see what's going to happen, but the statement actually from the president was very, very clear. We probably would not be able to get into nationwide, economy-wide, everything actually in the carbon market, but rather we're going to focus on major industrial sectors, power sectors, iron and steel, non-ferrous metals, chemicals, cements, among others. Why those major sectors? Partly because starting in the 11th five-year plan, we've been already targeting them. And we set the targets already for those industrial sectors. We started to understand better in terms of inventories and the technology levels and the potential. So it's in a relatively good shape, so that lays a good foundation actually for the country to move into a national level carbon trading platform. So we'll see that's going to happen. In the meantime, actually, financing becomes very, very important, as Sir Brian mentioned already. So financing is key, actually, to deliver a lot of the commitment. So domestically, China definitely has been entering into a new stage of green finance, which is very, very encouraging. Very recently, a month ago, and the People's Bank of China issued green bond regulation, which is new, brand new, getting into more financial products to really support the financing the solutions in reality. In the meantime, actually, China decided not to join Green Climate Fund at the international platform, which was announced back in Lima, December 2014. We decided to go separately, called the South-South collaboration. And last September in New York, the president committed 20 billion RMB money, actually, to designate it to the Green Climate Fund, so creating another financial flow or financial platform to participate actually into international sort of landscape in terms of tackling climate change issues there as well. Another issue actually is really technology innovation, which is very, very key, even though people in my sector, we often say, in order to address the climate change issues today, we pretty much have all the technologies available, most of the technologies available. But then the question will be, then why not? They haven't really played their role. There are a lot of issues, and the technology will continue actually to develop, particularly in the case of China. China does not want to end up one day, in order to address climate change issues and other environmental issues, that China has to buy technologies from everyone else. So technology becomes a very important driver for the government actually to develop, enhance its capability there as well. So that's in the landscape. So the decision makers in China, in the policy landscape, will become more sophisticated actually, rather than just command and control. Rather, we're bringing everyone together, including subnational government and the industrial sector, business, and the society there as well. Paris. Paris, from where I stand, I see it as a success. I spent literally 10 days in Paris last month during the COP, literally from the beginning to the pretty much very end. And I don't want to drag on the process, the success. I think actually the international community for the first time, particularly since Copenhagen, has agreed that to address global challenges like climate change, it really requires global consensus and global partnership. I think we achieved that actually in Paris, particularly reflected in the Paris Agreement. A lot of people asked about the role of China, including here I'm trying to address that as well. The way I look at it, China definitely decided actually to play a more constructive role to the international process, particularly around the climate change. The way the leaders sees it actually, it's more like as a part of the efforts for China to participate more and more so actually in the global governance mechanism. So climate change agreement negotiation is one of the cases that China is delivering its sort of ambition there as well. China's support effort started about more than a year ago, November 2014, at the APEC summit in Beijing. President Xi, President Obama joint announcement literally started the process that the two biggest countries' economies or largest emitters decided to join hands to support. And that started the process over the period of 2015. There's September more bilateral between China and the US, China, French, China and other developing countries. Pretty much the tone was very, very positive. See, we need to somehow really make commitments and support the success of a Paris Agreement, and that was sort of delivered in the process. And a lot of people challenging about to say, yes, we probably compromised everything, make sure we all accept it, so whatever the language in the Paris Agreement, we said all the correct things, but you read carefully what's in there. A lot of people are not very happy about it. Particularly, I heard a lot of complaints about it, say, China, US are not really committing anything at all, in the Paris Agreement at all. I think the majority of the international community interpreted it a little bit differently. If you look at this sort of glass, it's a half full, half empty. I'm standing on the half full side because I think that's a good foundation as a starting point actually for the international community to work together. That is why, as reflected in the Paris Agreement, basically we probably do not know enough at this moment. Rather than committing everything very solid with the exact numbers, let's give us some time actually. That's why the sort of review process every 5 years, stock taking, that sort of mechanism, all built into the Paris Agreement. I think China supported pretty much that process. Part of the reason why China was so open in the end, particularly on the review process, compared to Copenhagen, we didn't really know much back in Copenhagen. So the mentality, the tone actually compare Copenhagen and Paris was very, very different. No one expected actually, since Copenhagen, renewable energy technology could have developed so quickly and the cost could be dropping so fast that we could deploy, install more. And we didn't really have enough confidence back in Copenhagen time. But now there's a dramatic shift of the tone and mentality in the international community, particular leading economies actually. This becomes a new opportunity to compete, and so that you could innovate, and together we're creating a much, much larger pie so that we're all going to win actually bigger piece of the pie rather than zero-sum sort of the games there. I think I'm at time probably. Finishing up, and I will be happy to entertain more Q&A questions, discussions, so thank you for that.
Thank you very much indeed, and yes, I can hand that across now. So it's the right-hand one. Okay, and so Kevin too is going to, Daniel, if I can try to do it, is now going to take us further on the energy front.
Thank you very much, Chair, for your kind introduction, and it's a great honor for me to be invited to speak here today. I worked for the International Energy Agency. For more than 40 years, we are considered as a rich man's energy club because our members are all OECD countries. But currently, we have made significant progress in terms of engaging key emerging economies. China has joined the IEA as our association country in November last year, along with Indonesia and Thailand. Currently, we're in discussion with the National Energy Administration in Beijing for the option of establishing an IEA China Energy Cooperation Center in Beijing by the end of the year. If our initiative could be materialized in the end, then this will open job opportunities for many who are interested. Hopefully some of you here will work for us in the future. Now I'd like to talk about COP21. I was in Copenhagen more than 6 years ago. Back then it's very chaotic. So personally I consider COP21 in Paris as a success. I think there are two important reasons behind that. The first one, because of the French presidency. The second one is because China and the United States are willing to collaborate with each other instead of going to a confrontational mood before COP21. If we look at the ambition, many actually in the climate community didn't expect that 1.5 degree scenario will be mentioned in the final text. So I would say the ambition is much higher than what I personally expected before. In terms of Chinese commitment, I would like to highlight a few points. The first one, China committed to peak its national carbon emissions around 2030, not by. There's some difference in this regard. The second one is the emission intensity target, which is consistent with the previous commitment made in Copenhagen. And the third one is 20% of non-fossil fuel commitment, which also including nuclear energy. Let's look at the real ambitions we are mentioning today. If we look at all the commitment, the so-called INDC made by different countries, probably we are still quite far away from the 2-degree scenario, which also is the 450 ppm scenario in our World Energy Outlook report. So, as the International Energy Agency, we do have a so-called bridging scenario if the national government can follow our recommendation on energy efficiency, reduce inefficient coal-fired power generation, renewable investment, upstream methane emissions reduction, and fossil fuel subsidy reform. Many of these have been addressed by national governments in different parts of the world. We do believe we can move much closer to meet the 2-degree target. However, if we look at how the burden needs to be shouldered by different national governments, although China accounts for around 30% of global carbon emissions, but if you look at Chinese status, China still considers it as an emerging economy or a developing country. How could a developing country shoulder the most part of the emissions reduction obligation? So this is a question the international community and also the Chinese government itself need to figure out. Having said that, I do believe there's other incentive other than climate change that will drive China's energy transitions in the years to come. If we look at news reports, it's quite common these days to hear about the bad air qualities in China. However, I would like to remind everyone in this room, this is not a China-unique phenomenon. In the past, many OECD countries, including UK, encountered a similar environmental problem before. And also, this is an ongoing phenomenon in many parts of the emerging world, such as India, and even in some part of the developed world. I lived in Paris now. However, in some part of Paris during some part of the year, we also have some serious air quality problem. If we look at where China's PM 2.5 emissions are from, certainly we can easily see coal combustion certainly is the most important driving force behind China's heavy smoke. If we take Beijing as an example, the increasingly higher number of personal vehicles is important for the solution of this environmental problem. And also, if you look at the the share of PM 2.5 emissions from the adjacent region, which means the neighboring region surrounding Beijing, is near 25%, which means when we look at air pollution issues, you cannot deal with this challenging by one province, by one city. You have to deal with it from a regional and national perspective. When we talk about energy and environmental challenges in China, we often mention about the fragmented governance structure in the Chinese system. For instance, the energy policy is taken care of by National Energy Administration, which is part of NDRC. NDRC is in charge of climate change, and Environmental Protection Ministry is responsible for air quality related issue. However, I would like to argue today that this actually is not a unique phenomenon in China. If we look at the United States as an example, if we look at energy policy agenda setting in U.S., it's also fragmented among many ministries in the U.S. And compared with the United States, I would also like to argue both the NDRC and the National Energy Administration are quite powerful government agencies. So then the question is why we still face so many challenges in China. I would say the most weakest link of China's energy and environmental governance actually is enforcement of the regulation instead of the regulation process itself. If we look at one issue that's frequently discussed by the energy community recently, is whether the Chinese coal consumption has already peaked. IEA recently issued a report. Because of the gradual economic restructuring and the strong growth in low-carbon source of power in China, we at IEA tentatively concluded that coal consumption in China has already peaked. However, I would like to caution everyone in this room. Our assessment comes with greater uncertainties. Many who focus on China's energy sector may be alarmed by the recent revision of National Coal Energy Balance Table by the National Bureau of Statistics. The revision has been quite substantial. So as a result, because of the uncertainty associated with the statistic itself and the uncertainty associated with the economic trajectory of China's energy sector, I would say the peaking of Chinese coal consumption is only a very tentative conclusion made by the International Energy Agency. If we look at the recent low oil price, what's the implication for the energy and environmental agenda in China? Currently, the policy drivers remain quite strong to promote renewable development and a low-carbon economy in China. However, if the price of oil are kept very low for prolonged period of time, this certainly will have negative benefits on low-carbon development in China. This is a challenge which needs to be addressed not only by China but many part of the international community. Natural gas, although it's one sort of fossil fuel, it's widely considered as a bridging fuel between what we are now and what we need to be achieved in terms of low carbon development. However, recently even gas consumption in China has slowed down quite a bit. Last year's growth rate is only a single digit. This is the lowest in many years. So we still need to look at how to reform China's oil and gas sector in order to promote gas development, including unconventional, in the years to come. Now I'd like to talk about two additional topics. One is the nuclear development in China. Before Fukushima, China had the most ambitious nuclear development target in the world. However, after that, China drastically upgraded the safety standard of nuclear projects. Now only the so-called third-generation nuclear power plants could be built in China. However, if we look at the existing technology, no matter it's AP1000, AP1400, Huanong, or EPR, they are all not entirely mature technology. They still need more time to prove its cost effectiveness and also its carbon abatement potential in China. Another issue, of course, is renewable. Because of time constraints, I would like to directly go to the next slide. In terms of the take-home message, I would like to emphasize 2 points below. The first one, enforcement of the regulation itself is much more important compared with the regulation process itself. If the Chinese government can be more serious about enforcement of the regulation, I would say the no carbon development potential in China can be tapped in a better manner. The second issue is serious energy sector reform is a prerequisite for China to tap its full potential in terms of no carbon development. We have talked quite well for energy sector reform. Sometimes it's termed as the energy revolution, but if you do not unfold the scheme in an appropriate and timely manner, the window of opportunity might be closed. Thank you very much.
So we'd like to move on to a little discussion between us up here before we go to a Q&As for you to all ask your questions. But let's just think about the role of China in the Paris negotiations, which you certainly mentioned, Chenghua. I suppose, giving my background, over the years I've given a lot of talks about what we're doing in the UK, and often I've had this question, well, is it worth us doing anything, because China's building all these coal power stations and we're 2% of global emissions, so why bother? And I actually have given for many years that I think China might be an increasing part of the problem, but that China might be a major part of the solution. And I think I saw that actually happening very much this time in the run-up to Paris. In particular, a very important moment when the US and Chinese leaders actually gave very significant pledges for what they were saying in the run-up to Paris. So I think that was back in September, was it? Probably.
September.
Yes. So that was a very important moment for me. But perhaps we can just, how important do you think it really was, the Chinese move here? And you've already said something about that, Chenghua.
Thank you, Brian. I think actually the international community compared to Copenhagen, this round actually fully more and more actually recognizes the importance of China and the US in addressing global climate change issues there. To be fair, I think the two big nations leaders managed to do so, even maybe symbolically, whatever. So there is very strong positive actually recognition or contribution to that process. As some of the numbers, slides showed already, seriously, if China does not take enough actions within the time frame we set already, there's no way we're going to address the global climate challenges. So it's not like, I just feel China important as a Chinese, but rather seriously, addressing climate change issues, China is so important, and we all recognize that. And very encouragingly, Chinese leaders taking that also very seriously. So that's one side. There is the other side, though. And particularly looking into the details over the years, actually, as a professional participating into the international process and the politics, geopolitics in that, one sort of a little bit negative part, an argument basically saying, there are people saying China, whatever China is behaving, there are always people critical of China, basically saying, actually, you have US on this side, then you have India on this side, you're in a very comfortable situation. To a certain extent, that might be true. If you look at the US, so in the near term, with the US actually election in the process, to what extent actually, particularly now we have the Paris Agreement, and that's going to be ready for signature starting April this year, and leading, within a year time. So basically saying, we want all the countries to put their signatures on it. Seriously, you are really on it, rather than just said, cheered up actually in Paris. That remains a lot of uncertainty at this moment. So whoever will become next US president, to what extent actually the new president will be really immediately on board address climate change issues, that remains a huge question mark. So to that extent, people feel like, whatever, US won't really move too much. So China feel like, look at the US, right? You have a reference on this side. On the other side is really India. I think in the Paris process, actually, India faces a very different situation compared to China. In large extent, they feel like they lag at least 10 years behind China. And there is a sort of equity issue, fairness issue. And, we are a developing country. India remains even more developing country at this moment. And so you cannot just, ask us to do too much at this moment. And so even on the spot in Paris, India definitely struggled a little bit, actually, even though everyone in the end pulled out nicely. But in the process, actually, so in China had India on this side, which more like regarded as a dragging, actually, the process. So China, this is the second element to look at. China is sort of in a comfortable situation, right? And you have US and India. So whatever you do, you try to speak positively, you committed already, whatever. So that's a comfortable sort of situation. The third element is more like the driver. Why? Is it China really serious about addressing this issue? Absolutely yes. It's not just for the sake of just the climate change issue itself. And so we do have the international global challenge, but domestically, as Kevin mentioned already, really we struggle with domestic environmental issues there as well. So particularly visible challenges like smog issues there. I live in Beijing. You could imagine actually the life I've been through actually. On a regular basis, your mind set actually ups and downs depending, whether the wind blows or how blue the sky is. That's tough. That's really tough. So what that implies, basically, for China today to grow the economy, the costs have become so high on two fronts. One is economic cost, right? For energy, of course, coal is cheap today, so there is economic cost issue there in the whole landscape there. The other one is really the social cost. The people do not like that anymore, right? And they demand for much better, improved actually environmental quality. And so from that end, actually, so this is sort of two drivers, international front and domestic. So Chinese decision makers are really, really seriously about addressing these issues. It's not, as I said, it's not just totally for the sake of, the environmental or climate change issues there. There is a very important side of it, which I sort of mentioned, is really how China sees itself in the future global economic market. It's a competitiveness issue. So very exciting part of how the picture has unfolded actually during Paris and of course afterwards in the coming decades there is really the consensus of the large economies, particularly G20, if you say they are the largest economies. They decided to come together to leave, I call like a clean revolution. So rather than being stuck in the conventional sort of virtuous cycle, now we're after Paris, we're lifting up to the new sort of ground of the game. Basically, energy has to be clean, has to be efficient. We had to address the carbon issues. We had to address, of course, domestic issues like pollution there as well. So the mindset of the large economies, particularly including China there as well, is really to grow differently, right? So it turned out sort of burden sharing, that sort of I have to, my obligation, rather turn that into, this is how I'm going to compete, actually. And there are experts basically saying, okay, just look at solutions of the climate change issues, look at the technology. There are probably 6 countries who really going to be winner, and China is one of the 6. So the mindset actually becomes very, very different compared to Copenhagen. Back then, it's like a year, burden, obligations, responsibilities. Now, actually, this round is totally, dynamic, very actively pursuing different, actually, sort of development. Very important is we need to compete. You need to enhance your competitiveness issue, and China is totally in it.
Thank you. Kevin, do you want to?
Yes, I would also like to frame this issue from 3 items. The first one is Copenhagen. If you look at what happened after Copenhagen, let's put it in a polite way. The Chinese government realized it didn't gain anything out of the process, so the position on international climate negotiation have softened a lot thereafter. The second issue is because the bilateral relationship between the United States and China has become much more complicated over time. U.S. as the established power, China as the emerging power. Both sides have very strong incentive to handle the bilateral relationship appropriately. But if you look at different topics, both countries are interested. Energy, actually, and climate change issues, I would argue some quite few topics both sides can tackle this issue towards a pretty positive direction. So that's the second reason. The third one, I agree with Changhua. Air pollution is very important in this debate, because from the political perspective, domestic air pollution actually is much more urgent and much more important to the Chinese decision makers compared with international climate negotiation agenda. However, if we look at both air pollution and climate change issue, there's synergy. The largest one is no matter whether you are interested in climate change or air pollution, you need to deal with China's heavy reliance on coal consumption. China's proactive attitude, the cooperative attitudes ahead of COP21, I personally think this is a way to use the international commitments to pressurize domestic reform to move domestic energy and environmental agenda forward. Thank you.
Can I just
Yeah, sure.
add the fourth element, actually, sort of mentioned early on. This is also this generation of political leaders in China to look at China's role in the global governance, which I sort of mentioned early on. And it's a very serious one. And November 30th, actually last year, the first day of COP, and so 150 heads of states, spoke. And actually that day, including Chinese President Xi Jinping, for the first time, actually he articulated to the international community China's view of how the global government should be established, and particularly emphasizing China's role in it. So this is sort of a China sort of global strategy. It's a bigger picture. This is only one piece of the puzzle, actually. So there's a bigger context of the Chinese political leaders' view or vision of the global governance, and they had to handle actually COP, Paris process very carefully, very diplomatically, and very successfully. Thank you.
Very good. I don't think we've mentioned security of supply of energy as being a driver for China as well. Do you think that's?
It has been. I mean, energy security has always been, but I think Kevin probably from the IEA perspective, they all more like the expert on the energy side. Yes, that has been and remains so. But to a certain extent, actually, less and less talked about it. There's an overall energy strategy. Coal, of course, we have lots of coal. That's part of the reason. We do not have a lot of enough oil or gas. Of course, we have to rely on, actually, imports, whatever. That creates huge security challenges, risks for China. But in the meantime, if you look at how China has handled that, actually, Chinese president was in the Middle East, Iran, whatever. And so there's always this sort of energy sort of linkage there, because it's very, very clear. And there is an energy security issue, and there is a cost issue actually there as well. So China has to rely on the international market actually to supply at least a part of the energy to China. That has been an issue. I think will continue to be a part of it.
Energy security also should be part of the consideration. If we look at the energy value chain, the production part of and the transportation part are pretty vulnerable to extreme climate change scenario. Either you need to adapt to climate change, or you do something proactively to avoid such undesirable scenario to occur in the future. So that's why I think China is looking this issue from two perspectives. The first one is by participating in international energy governance, by working more with existing international energy governance body to address its rising energy security challenge. Of course, climate change and the COP21 can also be part of the overarching picture here.
That's, Chung Hua, you've mentioned India on one side and the US on the other. If we're looking at China, it's difficult to know which context we look, but just how challenging do you think the pledges are already made in Paris or before Paris compared with, say, the EU or the US? And it is a difficult comparison because we're looking at a strongly developing country still compared with the industrialized. But do you think that these are really challenging commitments that China has made?
The short answer is yes. I think actually, you cannot easily or simply compare the level of difficulties. Yeah. So I wouldn't really go towards that. Yes. I don't think you could compare the two, say, it's easy for you, it's not easy for me. No, I don't. I think we are operating, it is a global challenge, but when it comes down to specific targets, whatever, it's more like delivered within your jurisdiction. A couple of points to look at it. One, I don't think that's going to be easy targets. And the second one, actually, I don't think that's the target that we cannot possibly reach at all. So it's a target set based upon all kinds of scenarios and analysis, assessments. I don't think it's going to be to the very aggressive part. I don't think it's a very conservative part. It's somewhere in the middle, probably a little bit towards the more ambitious part. Basically, that's the way I look at this moment. Enforcement, implementation, becomes so critical in China. And at this moment, I feel confident, and particularly from the political leaders' commitment and from all the drivers actually coming together. And so I feel confident that China should be on the right track. I mentioned actually there's a 5-year plan and everything, and so we started. If 10 years ago you asked me this question, I wouldn't really know much. I just I don't know. We never tried that before. But now actually we have 10-year experience already. That's a very important learning process. That's also a confidence building up process there as well. In the meantime, actually, if you look at the technology progresses, I mentioned like solar and others, China getting more and more sort of familiar. So getting stronger in that landscape, so that helps hugely in terms of we could set more ambitious targets and really seriously delivering that. In order to deliver that, as I mentioned earlier, this is not simply I set the targets, I just deliver the targets. This for China at this moment is literally transforming your economy, your industrial, sort of structure at this moment. Is it easy? No, I don't think so. I think this is an overhaul of everything, actually. You cannot disrupt this large country. You cannot just stop everything here, then just shift it towards the other side. So this is sort of transitional period towards a grand new, cleaner, whatever future. So you could imagine, actually, how difficult this is and this will be. But somehow, as I said, I think the track record in the last 10 years in particular gives people the confidence that we're really serious about it, because all the drivers coming together, moving towards one direction. There's only one direction. It's not like, okay, this is one, then probably I could go there as well, or the other way. No, this is the only direction, actually, the vision set very, very clearly. So the consensus there is very, very importantly. In the meantime, I think the decision makers in China are also getting more experienced in terms of policy tools and also more holistic. Holistic in a way, I say, we do not just set percentage of the emission targets, whatever. Rather, we also set targets, mandatory quantitative targets, how we grow our industrial sectors, clean technology sectors, energy, of course, there as well, efficiency, whatever. So it's a very complicated, sophisticated landscape, actually. The decision makers are getting more and more good at, including market-based instruments. So that also offers you the confidence that we have tools, we have instruments, and the decision makers, people making decisions, actually understand it much, much better. That is why I said it's really started the process already, recreating a new landscape or ecosystems in terms of enabling the country moving towards the one direction we want to pursue. So from that end, I think I also feel confident. Again, back to the question, I cannot answer, I also say, compared to US, I say, I cannot compare, right? And we all have our difficulties. But in the meantime, China is not just uniquely, totally different. As Kevin mentioned in his presentations earlier on, there are a lot of issues that's common. For instance, in the EU, you have ETS. You had a lot of resistance from industrial sectors because they complain about the cost, what the competitiveness issues, and you would imagine Chinese business just totally say whatever the government says, they go along. No, right? And business is business. Market economy is market economy. Cost is a big issue, universal. It's more like this is sort of check and balance and trying to figure out, fighting with each other. But comparatively speaking, having a strong national government, political leadership, or governance mechanism helps hugely in this particular case, so that the strong leaders at the top level will be able to somehow create an ecosystem to make sure, if not everyone, actually, the majority of the business community and the society, subnational government, actually, to come along. And that is what we're seeing now more and more so in China today.
Okay, thank you. Kevin?
I agree with Changhua. It's difficult to make such a comparison between the climate ambition of the United States and China. If we look at the United States, its commitment is between the period of 2005 and 2025. But for China, in 2030, we're even not talking about the same year. In addition, in the U.S. is absolute emissions reduction. U.S. has quite transparent energy statistics. It's relatively easy to assess whether it's very easy or difficult for U.S. to meet its climate target. Then it's much better understandable whether it's the market-driven shale gas revolution or the government-driven policy change need to the desired outcome committed by the U.S. government. But if we look at China's commitment, is peak its national emissions around 2030. So there's uncertainty in terms of when exactly the emissions will peak. There's the biggest question mark at what level. Without knowing much about the absolute level of emissions committed by the Chinese government, I don't believe any agency could actually assess whether it's ambitious enough. Having said that, we also need to notice that the willingness to make a commitment to peak its national emission is a drastic departure of China's existing old school thinking of positioning itself as a developing country. So in this regard, I would say the political leader in China has been brave enough to move the agenda forward.
Thank you. I think that's a suitable point now to come to the Q&A, where, so if you would like to raise your hands, and I can already say, I think the first, perhaps we'll take we'll take three, okay? So.
Hi, good morning, distinguished panel. My name is Bi Shuan. I'm an LSE alumni. Thank you very much for this very encouraging talk. As a Chinese, I was very surprised how much we actually achieved, given the difficulty in implementation that we are all aware. So I have firstly a question for Ms. Wu. I would like, could you give some more color on what political tools have worked particularly well in the past 10 years to achieve these targets?
In China?
In China, yes. And also, you mentioned that alternative energy investing has played an important role in achieving this target. Could you just give us some more detail on this account, and how would the alternative energy strategy look like going forward, and what's the investment scale? And then I just have...
We're going to get 3 in 1 here, aren't we?
Sorry. Yeah, I have my...
I think everyone else was restricted to 1, okay? Well,
oh, sorry.
Yeah.
My last question is to Mr. Tu. So you mentioned the difficulties in implementation. Could you just tell us a bit more on the coordination of this policy implementation process? Because I studied cement, steel, and alumni industry in China, and I mean, even with those headlines of reducing overcapacity, the new added capacity in the steel industry will be 7% of the global steel output for the next 2 years.
Okay, right, fine, thank you. Right, okay,
yes,
right, you don't have a 4th one, I know.
Thank you, sorry.
Okay, actually, perhaps, is there someone with a question for Kevin then? And, yeah, okay, at the back there, yeah.
You can just shout, you don't have to wait for, yeah.
Well, I'm told that they may be recording, and
they're
is that...
recording?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, that's right, if you want your words immortalized. Yeah, okay, fine. Right, okay.
Thanks. I'm Chris. I'm a fellow at the Oxford Martin School in Oxford. Mr. Tu, I was really fascinated by the slide that you put that showed the different bureaucratic units that are involved in implementation. And I guess following on question number 3, if you could just talk briefly about the different roles and responsibilities of the NDRC, of National Energy Commission, and the agency, just to help us understand a bit more how the bureaucracy functions.
Okay, thanks very much. Right,
Yeah, sure. The question about the policy tools that worked, there are many actually, and one of them, just give you an example, and I talked about the targets, mandatory targets. So first, the 20% energy intensity targets between 2006 and 2010. We set the national target, then we break it down and allocate that to subnational government level and also to major companies. So it's a contract sort of between the national government and the local government, and also between the national government and those, CEOs actually of these large companies there as well. This is a typical sort of top-down sort of a solution, but as I said, in the current context, actually that works because no one can force local governments, the decision makers, governors or mayors actually to take on mandatory targets like that. That's why it still require, the mechanism that works in China, and also for large state-owned companies there. So far, it has worked. If you look at this according to official statistics, so we're pretty much on the track in terms of delivering those targets, and on both the local government side and also on the large industrial side there as well. Getting into this, 2 examples, 2 major pieces of legislation actually probably as a sort of a deeper dive. A year ago, so January the 1st, 2015, the newly amended environmental law became effective. And that day, actually, I was at CCTV studio live commenting on that piece of information that when it became effective. The way I look at it, really, it probably could be called the first environmental legislation that really has some teeth in it, right? And in it, basically, there's a couple of major sort of highlights. One, the financial penalties are much, much higher. So compared to before, you know, a lot of companies really, they had to seriously look at this issue. Secondly, is really even criminal charges actually against polluters and even local decision makers in cases, whatever. So since then, and in the last year, if you look at the number of cases to the courts related to environmental pollutions have been really stockpiling. There are many, many of them, more and more so. That was really progress moving forward. You know, a major piece of legislation started to play its role. So that's the sort of deeper, so the top-down law, whatever. The second piece of legislation, January 1st this year, 2016, the Air Pollution Prevention and Control Law became effective. And again, I was also at CCTV studio commenting on that day. If you look at this, and this is related to both air pollution and also you know, greenhouse gases emissions here, it was really, really serious. And again, actually build upon finally the sort of environmental protection law with the teeth. This is much, much higher, more restrictive there as well. And in it, one uniqueness about this sort of arrangement is something we debated actually a lot in the last few years, in a couple of years in China. It's something called appointment. So you do not find it anywhere else. Basically, if local decision makers are held accountable for environmental quality of your jurisdiction, if you fail, you will be requested for an appointment with higher level government agencies. This is not just a pleasant appointment, actually. So you have to go through, say why you have failed, and then more importantly, actually, you need to work out a very specific timeline and efforts, actually, in terms of deliver the targets there. So from that end, actually, that definitely, we started to see more effectiveness in terms of enforcement and implementations there. Alternative energy investment, I think there's so much out there already. China has been leading in terms of both investing in renewable energies and also in terms of installations. Solar, wind, I do not have all the numbers popping in my head. Probably Kevin has more numbers. It's already a great success. And also leadership. I think a part of the story is actually say why the international community started to have more confidence is because of China's contribution to renewable energy sector by manufacturing, industrializing, and also reducing the costs, so that the global community will be able to speed up the process to really scale up of renewable energy as a big contributor to the solution.
Right. Kevin, perhaps resist that one if you can, but can you deal with this one? Yes.
Deal with this one first. Okay. So on the top of the diagram is the State Council. Currently, Chinese Vice Premier, Mr. Zhang Gaoli, is in charge of the energy issues from the top level. If we look at the National Energy Commission, it now should still be chaired by Chinese Premier, but it's not so active. And the Secretariat of the National Energy Commission is at the National Energy Administration. National Energy Administration, NEA, is the regulator of China's energy sector, which itself is a deputy ministerial level agency under the most powerful domestic ministry in China, the National Development Reform Commission, NDRC. In the past, climate change responsibility was handled by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in China. The reason why the negotiation responsibility was transferred from MOFA to NDRC is because State Council considered that NDRC is the most powerful domestic agency. It's the only agency with the options to enforce the international commitment from a domestic perspective. So that's the reason for the transfer of the responsibility. In the past, the former Chinese Minister of Environment once mentioned, I'm in charge of carbon monoxide, not carbon dioxide, which is the status quo in China for now. Ministry of Environmental Protection only deal with local environmental issues instead of the global environmental issues such as climate change. And of course, there are many more agencies that actually are involved in this process. These are only a few listed here. And the Department of Climate Change under NDRC is the one actually directly deal with both the international climate negotiation and also the enforcement, or trying to enforce those commitments at a domestic level. Now I'd like to talk about...
Okay. I would like to get some more questions, so if you can make it very short on this.
Okay, sure. In terms of implementation of the regulation, I would say the ongoing anti-corruption campaign in China is part of the government efforts to deal with this issue. I also heard of the keywords of overcapacity. I think the most important part of trying to shut down certain abundant capacity in China is trying to avoid repeating the same mistake over time.
Thank you. Right. I think you had one there, didn't you? So one there, there's one there, so that we can move it laterally, and we'll have a last one over there, the guy on the end there.
Thank you very much, speakers. My question is short and simple. That's to Ms. Wu. In how many years' time do you think we can have blue sky in Beijing?
Right, okay. And if you hand it to the next one then.
Thank you. Well, as you mentioned that China is going through this huge change, and I think it's a quite exciting and interesting period. I just wondering that if you can give any tips to graduates or to us who want to help China to go through this process, just what can we do?
Okay, brilliant. Okay, excellent. And the final one over there, I made a mistake of actually getting someone to, so there's actually on the end, yes, on the end. I fear this is going to be the last one, actually.
Yes, good morning. As some of us will know, China has the largest shale deposits in the world. So but yet it's very difficult to extract them. So if there's any technology that can actually efficiently extract them, will this change China's green policy?
Okay, right. Why don't we deal with that one first then? Okay, so we'll
Quickly.
So, Kevin, you're going to deal with the shale.
Shale gas?
Shale gas, I think, yes.
Yeah.
So if this becomes really extractable, it's the largest resource in the world, perhaps, is it going to really change things?
Yeah, I happen to have visited both Sinopec's shale gas development in Chongqing and CNPC's similar development in Sichuan. My understanding is shale gas is a quite unique fossil fuel resource because it's very difficult to be extracted cost effectively by large-scale corporations, because the overheads and operation cost of this type of company are relatively high. And also, we need to look at some desirable geographic conditions in order to do it cost effectively. So that's the problem in China, because the Chinese energy sector is dominated by three national oil companies, Sinopec, CNPC, and CNOOC, maybe sometimes Yanchang. So in order to tackle this unique resource, I think it's right for the government to rely on national NOCs to first work on this resource. However, but in the longer term, they need market reform to allow smaller player, medium-sized to smaller-sized enterprise to work on this issue. And also, we need to carefully assess the geographic conditions of different part of the country, because not every reverse endowment has the potential to be extracted economically.
Right.
Okay.
I want to move to blue skies in Beijing. When?
When? It's a huge bet. $1 billion question, actually. I definitely look forward to the next 15 years, actually, between now and 2030. I think within that 15 years, things will be improving gradually, but we have to see clear outcome, actually, no later than 2030. Graduate school, you are the hope, and the world is yours, actually, and so you have to figure out your role. There are many, many ways you can contribute. It's hard to tell. I mean, this is not a job, employment, tutoring process. I run something called the Future Academy in China, but mostly targeting young professionals, young entrepreneurs. And I've been supporting a young man, actually, who's been doing something youth lead, that's targeting college students and really started to offering more opportunities, bring students closer to reality, because you cannot stay in the classroom actually just imagining your role. You have to be really to the reality. Okay.
Yes, so Kevin, you started by giving job opportunities in Beijing.
Yeah, already. So find him.
Actually, I would like to quickly respond to the blue sky questions.
Okay.
I live in Paris. Sometimes I was still troubled by air quality issues. So
only a couple of days.
Yeah, I'm not so optimistic. I would say China need to take a pretty long time to have blue sky again.
I would die.
And only if the country can do this in an appropriate manner. If you don't do it in an appropriate manner, it will take even longer time.
Okay.
I'm hopeful. So yeah.
Right. I think I'm afraid it's time we have to wrap this up, and I'd very much like to thank on your behalf Kevin Tu and Wu Changhua. Thank you very much. Thank you.